You might not know it, but I'm a typical Arab. My dad's Palestinian, my mother's Lebanese, I was raised in Kuwait, I went to school in Jordan, I've lived in Dubai for the last 19 years. But at the same time, I've got a funny American accent, I've got a British passport, and I think I represent this new Arab generation. No generation has seen change the way my Arab generation has. If we go back in time, not too far, just back to my 18th birthday, my entire media universe consisted of 2 TV channels, 1 radio station, and 1 newspaper. And that was it. And everything else we accessed from the outside world was heavily censored. You see, Arabs love a good conversation, but Arab governments love control. But what we've seen over the last 20 years leading up to the Arab Spring was a fundamental change in the way in which brands and governments and society as a whole interact with one another because of the change in media. And there's been 3 big changes that have happened. The first one was satellite television. And suddenly, those 2 awful TV stations weren't the only things I could watch. I had access to hundreds of channels, everything from CNN to BBC to slightly dodgy Italian and German game shows that had topless women on them. And at the same time, the rise of the mobile phone was incredibly powerful in changing the way in which we connected with one another. But the third one, the really big one, was the web. Because that really opened everything up to us. That was really when the genie came out of the bottle, and suddenly we went from having access to 2 TV channels to 100 TV channels to this billion-channel internet universe. The interesting thing about the internet is that it's not that governments could no longer control what we watched, they could also no longer control what we said. And that was a really big fundamental part of what led up to the Arab Spring in 2011, despite the best efforts of governments. If you look back to 2010, just before the Arab Spring, Reporters Without Borders put out their report called The Enemies of the Internet, the countries that were the worst offenders when it came to the censorship of the web and free speech. Interestingly, 4 of the 11 countries on that list were Arab countries. But what's really interesting is if you zoom in on those 4 countries, 2 of them, Egypt and Tunisia, both saw full-scale revolutions the following year. The third one, Syria, saw the start of a horrific civil war that we've not seen the end of. And the fourth one, Saudi Arabia, saw widespread protests in the streets. So what we see now is that the genie is well and truly out of the bottle. And what I'd like my talk to focus on is where is the Arab world today, 4 years after the Arab Spring? Looking beyond the politics and the cliches, what has social media done to fundamentally change society for us in the Middle East? What does the Arab digital generation look like? Because the Arab digital generation today is connected and young and confused. If we look at them being connected, they are the hungriest consumers of social media of any country in the world. If you look at Saudi Arabia, for example, they are the highest per capita consumers of YouTube of any country in the world. Twitter has seen 600% year-on-year growth in Saudi Arabia. These are people who are desperate to connect, both with themselves and with others. They're also very young. 65% of the Middle East's population is under the age of 34. So think about the implications of a generation of people that have grown up in the era of Facebook, of YouTube, of social media, where that's what they know. But the reality is that they're looking into these screens and seeing this incredibly modern and diverse world, but some of them are looking onto the streets and seeing a very traditional place. And so it's creating a lot of really interesting things in terms of how social media is affecting society. For example, the guy who created the film No Woman, No Drive, the riff on the Bob Marley film, where he created a film to kind of talk about the social problems around women not being able to drive in public. Or people on Instagram doing incredible things. You know, people who are selling sheep on Instagram, for example. There's a guy who does nothing but post pictures of his lions and his tigers and his Ferraris on social media. And they're confused, because what we find is a real breakdown between what we see as traditional values and modern values. But over time, as we become more exposed to the West, as we start to spend more time on social media where the primary language is English, we find ourselves incredibly conflicted between tradition and modernity, between West and East. But what I really want my talk to achieve is to show people what the modern Middle East looks like, what this Arab digital generation looks like. Because today, if you look at the Middle East, this is what you see. War, violence, the horror of ISIS, sectarianism, religion breaking down communities. That's not the side of the Middle East I want to show. What I want to show is how we take those things that have caused so many problems for us, the inherent contradictions between East and West, between tradition and modernity, between religion and being secular, and show how the young Arab generation is actually taking these things and creating wonderful things out of them. For example, focusing on people like hip-hop artists who are creating beautiful, what they call calligraffiti on the streets of the Middle East, or people who are painting up the streets of the Middle East with beautiful, vibrant colors to clean up these dirty old streets, or people who are using technology in amazing ways. Because technology is something that doesn't know borders, it doesn't know religion, it doesn't know boundaries, and technology is being used in such wonderful ways today to create jobs, to create wealth, and to create wonderful new tools, hardware and software and products that are changing the face of the Middle East and the world. So that's my hope for the Middle East, and I hope that you get to see my talk.